Alrighty, hello there. Don't mind me setting my stuff up a little bit. Got to do my usual moving of windows and things. I do believe I can manage that. Also, I'm going to be wanting to hide my face on the screen so I'm not distracted by such foolishness, and set up my chat window because this is Monday, so we are answering questions from chat, or at least that's most likely what this is going to be. So let's see. Boop. There it is. Right there you are. Scroll it down a little bit and scooch it in without too much trouble. You know, I wonder if I can tell this to be meh. Just trying to figure out whether I had it at full size or not. Could fix that. I'll make it be a bigger size. That'll work. Hey Ahmed, Andy, and so hi there. This is the Monday Q&A live stream. Today I have not dashed around. Fooling with the microphone again. Always got to fool with the technologies all day long. So today I haven't scampered around doing social media posts for this because this is the week in which I got banned off of Facebook. It came back, but that was interesting. And I do believe I have a lock on what caused that to happen, which is the very same social media share things that the YouTube page offers. So, yeah, like perhaps somewhat unhelpful, YouTube, as far as like offering me things that are only going to get me in trouble. That seems not great. And that also serves as a bit of a word of warning. Like if you are in a similar situation, then do not try to post stuff off of your built-in YouTube streaming thing to multiple Facebook things in one go. They will get real cranky about that. So, gotta be careful. Gotta watch out. So yeah, I also got a coffee, and I'm going to see whether I can settle in for an unusually long, for me anyhow, Q&A stream. Maybe not that far out of the usual, not that far out of the norm, but still. Because the thing is, somebody jumped on the Patreon and decided that they had bought like 6-8 plugins or something like that. So like, oh, okay, that's how that works. And it might just go away again. Honestly, I trust the little tiny donations better than the big ones, because the big ones, I feel often it's like, okay, you're just going to demand that I code something for you and then go away immediately if I say no. So, yeah, and you know, that's okay. People can work through whatever it is that they're working through around their expectations. As far as the new framing that you mentioned, and the it's a combination of things. I got a lens. I know, right? It's perfect enough, I suppose. And I can't smoke a cigar. I don't smoke. But It's a combination of a lens, and the lens is actually just the Lumix 20mm pancake lens. It's not a fancy, expensive, super pricey lens, although they all kind of are. They're kind of like the modular synthesizer stuff. But it is not as wide as the wide angle that I had, and not as narrow as the super low light 40mm or something that I had. So it splits the difference there. And hey, Ricardo, and it is also a Panasonic lens, which is fairly well thought of, and I'm pleased and surprised by how nice the optics are in it, because it's this funny combination. Like, you can see over there that what you'd call the bokeh of the lens, the blurriness, which is kind of what I was doing with yesterday's plugin. Yesterday's plugin, Chrome Oxide, is like a blurriness type of plugin. Well, with this lens, blurriness ain't as good as the certainly the more telephoto style lens that I had, and kind of not even the super wide angle one, although that one doesn't really go for blurriness because wide angles don't often do a really narrow depth of field. And the sort of long lens that I've got has a much nicer bokeh. Like, the blurriness turns into these cloudy veils of stuff, and that's just a sort of little glitch of, like, if it looks anything like what I did when I last looked at it, it's sort of little clusters of stuff, and it's not properly blurry the way you'd want, but it's okay, and the stuff that's in focus seems much nicer somehow. Like, it really nails that. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the bokeh seems funny, is because it's making even that be more coherent and in focus, which you don't want for bokeh. And then the other thing about it is just another one of those, yeah, I can. I even have a pen and paper. I also brought my notebooks in case we needed something to talk about, although you can ask me questions and keep me busy and I'll never have to crack these. But the notebooks are like whole piles of ideas of mine. Like this is about 2 of these full. Like, this one's full, this one partly, this one not really, but it went fairly well into it. And the other thing that's making it look like a film noir effect for you is I'm using that special lookup table that I did for making a watercolored color card show all the correct colors rather than hyper blown out reds and things. So that lookup table, that LUT, is at about 50% strength. And because if it's at 100% strength, it starts looking really bleached out. And yeah, this is a good day for just catching up with you folks and also answering your questions. And Bo did ask how Chrome Oxide works. So that's something that I talked about in the video, but then I can also talk about here. One downside to this is that since the framing is a little tighter, I think I like it, but the whiteboard thing that I set up no longer works with this current where everything is sitting. So I need to come up with like some kind of artist stand, and which I could probably get one. I don't think that's going to be too hard, but I need to get basically an artist easel and put a little chunk of whiteboard on that so that it can be held up in a useful place and hopefully not take up too much space. Like one sitting like right here at about the same level, as long as I could write on it okay, that would work out pretty well. So yeah. Oh, And the chord circle, I'll do that next. I'll do this next. First, bow. The deal with Chrome Oxide is that it is not the same approach as I do with other tape simulators. So, and yeah, this chord chart, and I'm working on getting it all together. You can incorporate that stuff if you know how to play different chords in majors or minors, and or on the guitar or whatever, and possibly add some other funny things to them. But on the whole, if you just go with that and then learn to like punch them into your DAW or whatever, that'll work just as well. Oh, Tony is posting a YouTube symbol. Interesting. I've never seen that before. It's a play symbol. So, the deal with Chrome Oxide is that it's splitting audio into two sections, and there's a bass section which I believe is getting distorted a little bit, and then the high section, we're taking a little buffer of 5 samples, and what it's doing is the intensity of it is operating a random effect where it's grabbing results from one of these on just the highs. It's leaving the lows alone. But I think there's a really early version of Chrome Oxide that did that overall, over the entire audio. But the one, this final version here, oh yeah, Brazil is suffering corona-wise. But these 5 sample things that you get, it's randomly picking among those, and it's interpolating between them. So any place that is partly like halfway between two of these is going to give you a interpolated value, which will cut high frequencies down. So that's inherently going to reduce that. And then the bias control makes what's already somewhat random and can spread over a larger range. The bias control scooches the start farther back. So what it's doing is like misaligning the highs and lows so that the lows will hit first, and then the highs, even if there isn't any randomness in there, the highs will be delayed somewhat, which is incorrect as far as putting it back together into a coherent result. So you will get like phase cancellations and things in here, but it's also randomized, so the phase cancellations are not stable. They scatter a little bit. And the result of that is the more you have a bias, the more this is kind of delayed, and the highs will form like funny comb filtery effects and such, and will also blur and will also soften. And then the more of the intensity, the more randomness you have in there, the more scatter you get, and the fuzzier the result is, and the more you get a kind of noise in there. In fact, you do in fact get noise, but it's noise from frequency modulation of only the highs out of the audio. And that is Chrome Oxide. And honestly, I was quite surprised at how well that worked for me, because I didn't remember it being all that good, but at the time that I made it, I hadn't heard Boards of Canada yet. And a favorite internet comedy troupe, Loading Ready Run, I've sometimes shouted them out. Also, it's fascinating what YouTube is doing to me. Like, I'll say this, that what frequency do I split the bands at? I don't remember. Some frequency or other. I think it must be fairly low, but I'm not really sure. The code's online, But I was just going to say, like, I love what YouTube does to me sometimes, that first of all, they set up all this, please tweet and Facebook your streams when you're going live, which got me in trouble with Facebook, and they banned me for a brief period. And now I have a live chat full of all you folks, at least 3 that I can count, and the participants show you 3 and me, and the concurrent viewers on the page that I'm looking at shows 1. So apparently none of you are viewing this or listening to what I say. You're just talking, which is fine. So yeah. And Ahmed, you did indeed join the... Oh, didn't you join the Discord server? I think that was set up to be a Patreon thing. But I saw you on Discord, so now you can message me on Discord because I am publicly accessible there. So there's that. I wouldn't worry about my Discord server because it is dead as a doorknob. Nothing is happening there at all. There is no activity, and what you should do is join Colin Bender's server because that's where all the musicians apparently are. And there's also one called Zerna, which is a Axolotl hardware offshoot. I think the crossover bow is in the mids, but I'm not sure. Michael, it's not a new camera, it's the same camera. What it is a new lens, and it's a Lumix/Panasonic lens, which is 20mm, and it's the 20mm pancake lens. In fact, I believe it is the first pancake lens, because it was sold as version 2, so I bought it as version 2. They say that the version 2 has like autofocus better, but there are some things about the visuals maybe not as good. And that version 2 has metal parts, and version 1 is the one that was made out of plastic, and this seems to be made out of plastic. So I think that Adorama sent me a wrong lens, and I got to bear that in mind. But it may be wrong, but it seems just as good as far as I can tell. I'm quite happy with it. Oh, neat. Okay, so my concurrent viewers is not trustworthy at all. That's interesting. In that case, there's no point in me looking at it, but whatever. Vinyl, you have a question, namely, would it sound good to load Chrome Oxide after tape, or will that screw things? You know, I'm not sure which would be better first, but they kind of do independent things. So basically, as long as you're okay with double softening and you want more of the scruffy, noisy kind of quality, you can combine the two. And I would put it before tape, and I'll tell you why. I'd put it before tape because tape also has a treble softening quality to it. And that means any noise that you generate with Chrome Oxide through its little random scattering, that is going to be further softened by going through tape. So I would put it first rather than second. And there is no Discord server for the Minecraft stream. We're using a TeamSpeak server. And if you can run TeamSpeak, then you should be joining us and playing with us. Certainly join us and play with us rather than just like hassle us or whatever. We're pretty chill. So, Zachary is asking, do I love Violent Femmes self-titled? One of the neat things about the first Violent Femmes album, amazing bass player. One of the strongest things you can do for making any music is make the bass be amazing. That is key. And the bass player on that first Violent Femmes album, absolutely amazing, fantastic. So, Bo, since I'm shuffling 5 samples, kinda, but then what I'm doing, it's also, the shuffling of the 5 samples is also messing with mid-range in an interesting way, because we still combine the two, like the bass and treble stuff, but if one is offset, that makes weird interference patterns, and that's being done on purpose. So, like, technically, if you have bass happening and you're shuffling 5 samples over the entire spectrum, it's still going to affect it. It's just not as much. It's much like doing the chord organs and coming up with the 340K sampling rate, which I'm not making that up. Teensies are capable of doing that. You'd think that wouldn't affect bass, like that you'd be playing a bass using its primitive little sine wave, and there would be no benefit. But it turns out that bass improved noticeably too. So I don't think, like shuffling 5 samples, it is in fact still going to affect the bass, because your perception of bass is so strongly colored by just how smooth it can be. You really hear into that very easily. Stephen has a quick question with the interpolation smoothing the highs. Would it require a blend of 2 disparate simple? Well, I would say low and high frequency, which is offset by a number of samples. And that's exactly what's happening, is I'm reconstructing the signal, but the highs have been offset somewhat. And that's not the only time I've ever done that. I'm pretty sure in C-strip, or at least in some old EQ that I did, I had a trick going on where I was manipulating, like if I was pulling something back in volume, I also scooched it back in time a tiny bit to mess with that on purpose. It's not correct, but it's a sound sculpting thing that you can do. So Tony, the thing about this is that's a teensy. That is not a recording at all. The thing that went from 44.1K to 340K is a chord organ module, and I don't think I could really do that with the radio music version of that module, because the thing about it is that that module is basically a host for a little tiny experimenter board called the Teensy that costs about $20. And it turns out there were people talking about this because they were going, I have a Teensy, it can record sounds and I can patch this mic through it, but I want to record bat sounds and pitch them down. But using a Teensy rather than using, like, I don't know, audio gear. And the thing about that is they didn't really, nobody working in this area, nobody developing the Teensy firmware or the Teensy audio stuff seems to have any idea of the significance of things like aliasing, because people don't know about this stuff. This is like, I've been pushing the limits on these things for, geez, way over 10 years, and I'm not especially limited by conventional wisdom on digital audio, which is why I make stuff that sounds different than Random plugin developer. And I'm based out of the audiophile world, and I'm willing to consider some of these things outside of just, again, conventional wisdom. So the deal with this upgrading of 44.1 to 340K is that it's not a recording. It's not a recording at all. It's a little tiny chip. If I had these out, I could show it to you. It's a little chip that's about yay big. And it has a little computer on it, and it has a USB thing. You can plug it into USB and program it. And there's a little thing that you can do where you plug it in and you push a button on it and it programs it and reboots it. And the thing about that is, if you were generating audio through this device and it's decided, like, I'm going to generate audio at 44.1K, although technically I'm only generating a square wave, and I could be doing that up into the megahertz for all the difference it would make, because the computer doesn't care. Like, if the Teensy is running at like 96 megahertz, it's a computer. It's like a processor. It might not be the fastest in the world, but all those run very fast. And so it doesn't care whether it's making a square wave at 44.1K or 340K or a few megahertz. The audio stuff, there's this primitive little DAC built into it. And by primitive, I mean it's mono, and it is 12-bit, which you would think would be very inadequate, but square waves only require 1 bit, right? Like, back to the drawings and stuff. So square wave, that's just 1 bit. You don't need bits for something like this. So if you're telling the 12-bit thing to make a square wave, it's able to do that just as well as a 24-bit would make a square wave. It doesn't matter. And then if you're telling it to do a different sample rate, basically there's just code to do that, and you're programming the internals of the teensy. If you tell it to go too high, it'll stop being able to keep up and the machine kind of crashes and doesn't work. So you restrict it. I gotta say, I was astonished at how far I could push that. I did not realize that I could push it to 340 kilohertz. I thought I was going to be like maybe get 96K if I was lucky, but no, it went way, way, way beyond that. And yeah, 340 is higher than 192K, like about close to twice as much as 192K. And the thing to bear in mind there is this is not a sampling system. This is not a digital audio recorder. It's a very primitive signal generator. So naive generation is what causes this. Anything done in a computer is going to involve some like reconstruction filters and things. This does not. The teensy is just a really primitive 12-bit output. It doesn't follow the normal rules. So if you jack the sample rate up to incredibly high amounts, then you just continuously get finer resolution on the like vertical places where these lie, and there's never a partial one. They can't smooth this out in any way. Instead, let's take another, actually let's here, more pictures. So this would be sampling rate, and this would be the signal generation. And if you were doing signal generation with this primitive stuff, it can't give you like a half position between some of these things to make it attempt to go across between the two samples in any way. All it can do is identify the nearest ones, and it'll switch on those, not in the middle. It'll switch on those. And the way that those go back and forth, because if you have a steady frequency, it's not even going to be random. Instead, it's going to be these patterns, and that's what aliasing is. Aliasing is the variations in this, like frequency modulation, of where the square wave switches over in such a way that you start getting wrong notes out. You start hearing overtones. They're like harmonics, but they can be subharmonics. They can be way lower or way higher than what the frequency is. I think they can be higher. It certainly can be lower. And they can be quite loud. Like in that chord organ video, you can see what that does. I start playing the high frequency square wave chords and it turns into just a nightmare. And I start playing the wavetable stuff and it becomes completely horrible. The big shock to me was how much better the wavetable stuff got, and I can show you that as well. But I do also want to chase some of these questions before they scroll right off the screen. So yeah, Tony is asking, how can I upgrade? You can't. You can't upgrade the recordings if they're already 44.1K. I'm generating stuff at a native 340K. And if you can do, like somebody on the Airwindows Facebook thing was fooling around with They were fooling around with resampling and found that it worked really well for them, which makes sense because you're running the plugins at a higher sample rate. So, quick answer to Ahmed: if your final export is in 44K, will you record and mix in 96K? Don't record and mix in 96K. Final export at 96K, and use a sample rate converter to remove that down, because a sample rate converter can run offline and use as much CPU as it needs to like perfectly make a filter that's higher quality than you can do live to accurately remove the overtones that you need to remove. It can do as much processing as it needs. It can remove all the overtones super accurately, and then when you get your 44.1K, it's done properly. So don't do a final export in 44K, do a final export in 96K, and then SRC it to 44.1K if you even need to after the fact. So Leon's asking about audio drivers. I don't have a lot of control over audio drivers. Audio drivers is a can of worms, and stuff can go terribly wrong with them, and basically there's not a lot I can do about them. So the deal with the recording through the audio drivers, I certainly advocate recording through stuff, but you're kind of at the mercy of the company making the interface that you're using and working on that. So I'm getting more specific questions turning up. So Pablo quickly is asking how to use consoles with channels. Try stuff out. Console needs to be used in a specific way. Channel and interstage and like tape and whatever are things that you can just throw more of on if you want the effect that they do. You have to know what you want. There's not I can't give you instructions for like this makes good. Depends on what your audio is, depends upon what your desired result is. Is it possible to make something that forces things not to alias at all? Yeah, analog. I use analog because it never aliases. It kind of can't. It doesn't have discrete distinctions for capturing audio at a given set of rates that can interfere with things. So, yeah, I use analog for that, but if you are running a crazy high sample rate, and I would say with naive things like the signal generation from the chord organs, like teensies and stuff like that, if you're generating things like square waves, you can definitely tell it to do super high sample rates. If you're doing digital recording as like a normal DAW, I don't think you gain as much from going to crazy high sample rates, because what you want to do is be somewhat excessive in the sample rate, still be able to operate stuff, and then if you need to go to lower sample rates, do it properly. And that's all you're really going to need, because the rest is just choosing, like, don't overuse plugins and use a fairly clean path of things. It's interesting. Like, we're talking about interfaces and drivers and things. Just this morning I discovered an interesting thing on my monitoring situation, because I listened through Lavry, and I'm very happy with that stuff. I had a DA10 for a really long time, and in the last year I was able to get an AD10, so I have both of those now, and that's what I capture audio through. Not multi-track audio, but what I capture the music mixes and things through. And if I was to mix stuff on my analog board and for people, it would go to the Lavry. And the interesting thing about it is it has 3 different settings for clocking. The DA10 can go up to 96K. Lavry doesn't believe in 192K, and I kind of am along with that. And so he doesn't offer it as a option. But he has wide, narrow, and crystal. And the thing about that is, like, it's about the phase locked loop. Like, some goofy drawings here. So wide is like getting audio from the computer, and the clock rate, there's a wide range of possible things. Like you could give the 44.1K 32K and it would lock on somehow, because it's going to just chase the incoming clock and accept just about anything. But what you want is to have the same thing as a built-in clock that's running super regularly, which compared to that, generating your own clock is like this. It's going to be stable. Or maybe like generating your own clock might be like this. It's not perfectly stable because nothing is really perfect in the world. So the thing about that is that you're trying to avoid exacerbating these little wiggles. These are called jitter in digital audio. So a wide clock will rapidly trace any of these things, and it might do some overshoots as it's trying to follow the speed of what the sample's coming in. So it might make this jitter somewhat worse. And what that sounds like is the audio doesn't sound as deep or as warm or as nice. And it's not like you lose high frequencies or whatever, but just focus. Focus gets messed up and stuff starts sounding flat. And you want to avoid degrading this kind of stuff. So what they've got is 3 separate things. Wide is the one you can actually go up to about 110 kilohertz. If you feed 192K to the wide thing, it will do about 110 and downsample it a little bit. If you feed normal stuff to the wide input, it will catch it immediately. It will be very quick, like low latency. And then there's the narrow. Narrow is much more fussy about what data you give it. So if you feed irregular, like jittery audio, narrow could lose track. It can't steer its clock rate as well. So it's more fastidious about that, and you can break it more easily. You'll like lose clocking and stuff will stop working. And then there's crystal, which I had considered to be the ideal option. And what crystal is you're getting this stuff coming in, and then there's a black box, which is like a buffer, and you're saving a bunch of the samples, and it is generating its own crystal and directing the crystal in such a way that it sort of slowly approximates. Like if your incoming clock is wandering, so it's going like this, it's getting faster because it's not good. What crystal would do is it'll play a perfectly consistent clock, and then over maybe a 10-second period, if it needs to catch up, if its buffer is running out, then it will increase the speed of the clock a little bit or decrease the speed of the clock a little bit to keep the buffer the right amount. So one of the things about this is slower latency. If you're listening through the crystal setting on the Lavry DA10, you're getting a noticeable delay in the output. If you're like tracking through that, maybe not so good. But it's supposed to be incredible, pristine sound. But what I noticed this morning, because I was reading something about the Lavrys, trying to figure something else out. I was trying to figure out what the tone options on the 8010 are, and I'm going to have to just experiment with those. people were talking about, oh, the mysterious narrow setting. Oh, the special sound of the mysterious narrow setting. And I went, huh? Okay, well, I hadn't really considered that. It went wide narrow crystal, so I thought it was good, better, best, automatically. And I got one of my music things, which these you can download because they're on SoundCloud. $24.96. If you need audio that has like the MIDI verbs and things and sound spaces in them that are useful for you to tune your gear in with, that's kind of what that's there for. So I picked something that I had done where I knew that I had like a deep reverb space and was doing things on purpose to try to make them be amazing. And I started listening and comparing the crystal and the narrow output. And I was startled to discover that I liked the narrow way better. And I think I know why. The current situation is not being clocked by the Mac or by the Motu or by whatever might have a really poor and inadequate clock that needs much correction from any of these things. Instead, it's being clocked by another Lavry. The master clock is the Lavry AD10, the capture device, which is what you should do if you're doing clocking with any digital thing. The thing that's capturing analog for you should be the master clock, because that's the thing that should steer. Everything else should chase it, whether it be the computer or playback DACs or whatever. The thing that's capturing the audio needs to be the master clock so that it can run as smoothly as possible. And it turns out that using that as the master clock and sending it to the DA10, narrow sounded better. And my assumption on this is that it is part of my sort of simplification protocol for if you're doing a thing and it's capable of running with a simple like phase lock loop for the narrow section and keeping it very it's less going on versus going, let's make an ultra clock. It'll do the crystal clock. We will generate a new clock that and run a big buffer and put a delay in and then record this and synthesize a whole new clock out of what we already had, and we'll play that and it'll slowly chase those. I mean, it's supposed to be very clean. It's supposed to be changing only over the course of like 10 seconds or so. So in theory, that should be really pristine. There shouldn't be a problem. And yet, I felt like there was a naturalness and a physical kind of presence going on. So now it's set to narrow rather than crystal, because I noticed that and I went, I bet I know why that's happening. I bet that's because I'm clocking off of another Lavry, and that Lavry is generating such a good thing that messing with it, rather than just accepting it, is another level of, it's like another level of overprocessing, but for clocks. And that was very interesting. So that's kind of like the drivers and interfaces and things. They can be tricky. I've got very nice drivers, and even so, I'm finding that it can be tricky. I'm finding that like what's supposed to be the highest quality one, because of other things in my chain, is no longer the highest quality one, that I'm getting better sounds out of the narrow setting than the crystal setting. And that would be my bottom line for that. So let me shut up about Lavries and stuff, because I don't think most of you guys are burdened with Lavries. I've got a few more chats going on in here. Fab filter Saturn. You see, I disagree with oversampling in plugins. That's just something that I don't. I'm not down with. So by all means, they can do that. But boy, it would be killing CPUs and one. You shouldn't be doing oversampling if you're already running at 192K. You should use simpler processing. Homero is using 2-tape 5 on analog VSTIs. Yep, that'll work. And you might try the new Chrome Oxide plugin on that as well, if you want to fuzz it up a little bit as well as fattening it up. Can I recommend an FX chain that sickens up the virtual synths? Looks like you're already discovering that. I don't think you necessarily need my instructions for it. You're already finding that kind of stuff. So, you know, tape emulation plugins and thickening up can have a number of different meanings. Like the 2-tape options and tape itself, the one that's just plain called tape, have head bump qualities that boost bass, but that's not the only way to do what you're trying to do. Like, this is something that I was working with actually in analog, from starting with the original chord organs that were 12-bit things running at 44.1K, and I had to kind of band limit them to try to get rid of aliasing artifacts. Never really worked all that well, but at the time. But so you can be using things like 2-tape that have low frequency boosts, but you could also look into things like Chrome Oxide will blur and fuzz things, and that might be useful to you. Or iron oxide is effectively a band limiting thing. Iron oxide will give you some saturation, so it'll bring stuff forwards, which is what saturation does. But it also has a high frequency and a low frequency cutoff. It acts like a band pass. But especially with regard to the low frequency cutoff, the band pass is really unusual. Band pass is being done in a way that's involving prime number sample spacings. So when you're using iron oxide to band limit, it's not a clean band limit. Instead, it has a little fuzz and texture to it, and that could be useful to add to an analog VSTI. So look into iron oxide with like VST synths that you're trying to give more character if you don't want to just make it be super bass or whatever. Stuff that needs to be more mid-rangey, iron oxide might work out really well for you, and it's certainly going to give interesting characteristics that are not part of just the raw VST. So would saturation plugins such as Precious and Tape benefit from oversampling? Not necessarily, and I'll tell you why. I've made this argument before, but I can always do it again. So here we have a little sketch that is like frequencies, the Nyquist limit, and this is a harmonic. This would be a sine wave on a waveform. And if you distort it, and you distort it with a soft saturation, you'll get one harmonic at a time. You'll start getting this one, and then you'll start getting another one when you've got enough of this one. But if you're soft saturating rather than hard clipping, then you're not generating all the harmonics ever. Because like if you hard clip, you're generating a huge series of harmonics that basically are infinite. Hard clip means you put a sharp little corner, and the corner has all the harmonics in the world. And much like the corner of generating square waves. So hard clipping always, or anything that happens incredibly fast, whether it's a compressor kicking in instantly, or hard clipping, you're generating harmonics that go forever, but the Nyquist limit doesn't let you make harmonics that go forever, so it'll generate as many as fit, and then as it keeps going, the ones that are supposed to be out here beyond the Nyquist limit show up bounced into here, and that's aliasing. That's what aliasing is. So I drew them underneath because they're the ones that don't fit in a harmonic series. Once it bounces off this Nyquist limit, which is what it looks like if you watch the sine wave sweep up, it looks like the harmonic is bouncing off and going back down again. That's immediately making it be a inharmonic overtone. It's the same volume as the one that it was at first, but here's the thing. Like, as far as having to oversample, first of all, you can't oversample with the quality of good outboard SRC. If you do sample rate conversion using a proper program out there, and they exist for Mac and for PC and all over the place, I favor the Mac program Brick, which is from the dawn of time and is incredibly old. And there's a lot of places where people have studied this greatly, and you want to look for basically perfect behavior in the sampling thing, the sample rate conversion thing. And to do that, they wind up chewing up lots of CPU and maybe not even running real time on a modern computer. You can tell these things like, oh hey, do your calculation so that it takes a half an hour to render a 3-minute song. And if you do that, it's like going through the overprocessing and out the other side to magical perfection land. You can make it so that it is completely obliterated all aliasing by just overthinking it. And you're never going to do that within a plugin. Plugins are not going to have the quality of sample rate conversion, of good outboard sample rate conversion. So basically, the secret here is if you're making audio, a lot of sounds aren't going to alias even if you distort them. Like if you've got a nice bass note in here, you can distort that real hard, especially with soft clipping that doesn't make a sharp edge in the sound anywhere. If you're doing soft clipping, or if you're doing processes that don't respond instantly, then the harmonics they will generate will tend to be still within the audio band. And if you're not generating a harmonic beyond the Nyquist limit, whatever it may be, you're not going to have aliasing. Like, I mean, in theory, it's like, well, theoretically, it might be generating supersonic frequencies at 3,000 dB down, to which my response is, go ahead. I don't care. Like, not everything is sharp clipping. Not everything is instantaneous compression changes. And those are the things that generate lots of higher harmonics. Smoother things like density, just about everything that I do saturation-wise. If you talk about saturation, you're already talking about soft clipping. Hard clipping is a whole different story. And in fact, stuff like my 80 clip and clip only aren't using naive clipping. They're doing something else that is muddying the issue and not necessarily giving you an arbitrary signal that is not the same thing as the hard clip signal. Also, one corner clip does that. It gives you an arbitrary signal that does not follow the same rules and does not generate the incredibly sharp corner that causes all the aliasing. So yeah, you don't necessarily, the assumption that saturation plugins by definition benefit from oversampling is not correct. It depends upon whether this thing that you're saturating is already going to automatically generate supersonic frequencies, and not just supersonic, but beyond Nyquist frequencies. Like if you're running at 96K, the treble that you are using in order to generate the thing that's going to alias is going to have to be really bright. It's going to really have to be way up there. And who's to say that you're going to take your cymbals or whatever and throw a harsh distortion on them? You could, but will you? Are you going to take a square wave sound and throw a harsh distortion on it? You could, but will you? Fairly often, the stuff that we try to saturate or distort is muddier, softer. That's why we're trying to get more harmonics into it. And then if you're trying to distort stuff that is already bright, maybe you're looking for aliasing or nastiness or whatever. And it's one way of causing nastiness. Like the stuff that I did with the chord organs, I'm not going to do it, but you can also tell it to have really low sample rate, like 3,000 hertz. So the whole things, they can run on now 3,000 hertz or 500 hertz. And that's just a pile of alias. That's just a pile of ugly in every respect. And it's quite terrible. But people can do stuff like that on purpose. So I would say, rather than make saturation plugins and have to always oversample them, I would say don't always use saturation plugins for everything. And it's interesting. I have to wonder, and it's probably worth finding out, if I put pathologically, I'm pretty sure that with something like console, you can't actually undo, which is why I like running stuff at 96K. If you were running at 44.1K and you run a 19 kilohertz tone into that real loud, console works on saturating and then anti-saturating. So the base console system, by design, if you're running super high frequency stuff into it, it probably will generate some aliasing, although the amount of saturation that it produces is very, very slight. And it's also somewhat amplitude dependent. The quieter you are, the less distortion is going to be in the situation. So if you have a 19 kilohertz tone that would distort like crazy when played super loud, but you're in a mix, and remember with console, you only feed stuff into it at the amplitude that you wanted in the final mix. And if you want to do anything with lows at all, you need to have the highs be quieter than that. So you're compelled to run your high frequency tone into the final mix at a reduced level, at which point it's barely touching the soft clipping, so almost nothing is happening to it, so it's not really getting aliasing because it's simply not loud enough to go into severe distortion. With your 19K thing, just about anything that you do with it distortion wise in a 44.1K session will cause aliasing. But if it's being brought in really, really, really quiet into a console mix, you're not close enough to the distortion point to see much of that happen. So yeah, I am just not impressed by oversampling. I'm just not. I'm sure there are things that it's really good for. I just don't find them as a rule in what I do. I'd rather work around things in different ways, like not generating as much. Stephen has caught up with my lack of thought and running out of things to talk about by asking a question that's very relevant. Does clip only take into account intersample peaks? My answer to that is kinda. Here, do I have blank paper? I do. So what clip only and the 80 clip line in general do is say you got some samples and you've got this one, and then you're going to clip here because your audio is going past the clipping point. So here's the thing. What clip only will do mechanically is attenuate this one. Like, the way that it works is on both the positive and the negative swing of the wave, if it's going to be producing a sample that is beyond this point or at this point, and the previous sample wasn't that far down, it won't go immediately to that point. What it will do is go partway. Let's say it goes halfway. That means this point, trying to get to that point, will acknowledge that it's supposed to be at the clip point, but since the previous sample was not there, we'll call it halfway, and it'll put a sample there. And then the next one is not clipped anymore, so that's fine. So what we've done is we've gone from the waveform with the sample way up here to a waveform that doesn't clip at all. And that's because clip only decided, since this was going to be a clipped point and then this was not, it's only going to go halfway to that point. Now, what happens when we're doing that and then there's a series of samples that are clipped? Then it will start doing something else, namely, here's the one that is not clipped. So we're going into the clip zone here. This one's not clipped. This one's very clipped, but again, it's the 80 clip design. So what it's going to do is go, okay, this is supposed to be a clip, but our previous one was not, so we're going to go halfway between where the previous one was and the clip point. And then from that point onwards, it starts to give you the actual clip numbers. So our waveform here goes to that clipping position, but it does it by softening the onset. And here's the thing, is softening the onset is going to diminish intersample peaking. Because intersample peaking is like when you have samples around here and the reconstructed waveform in being put back together again needs to go, if it has to go through these points, the reconstruction has to go beyond the power supply rails. That's what intersample peaking is combinations of samples that are legit within the system, but in order, you would never capture this directly. Like if you were capturing digital audio with a good converter, you'd never get this, because you'd have a waveform that was within the range of possible, clipped stuff. And so it would be having these samples farther in just because it was recording audio within these clip points. And then it's going to always put in, same thing for if you were oversampling or running at 96K or 192K, and then you generate like 44.1K out of it, you're never going to get the sample positions far enough to cause intersample clipping. If you're downsampling properly, it will never produce intersample clipping because the frequency limiting, stopping stuff from aliasing, also prevents these crazy high frequency bursts. But editing stuff in the digital domain, you can move these around within the limit of like -1 to +1 and inadvertently produce stuff that's going to produce crazy intersample clipping, especially when you're like boosting highs in the digital domain and stuff. This is why boosting highs is nice in analog rather than trying to do it in the digital. Cutting stuff in digital is often acceptable. Brightening stuff in digital is often big problems. But yeah, here's the thing, is if you are generating stuff that is pushing these high frequency peaks beyond the clipping point, then it's going to do its little, okay, let's only go halfway to the clipping point because this is our first clipped sample that 80 clip does, at which point you've solved the problem, or at least worked around the problem, because you're softening the onset. Now, it could also be possible to sort of build in a lower clipped frequency and do the same technique, but try to do it intentionally to do intersample peak limiting. And I can make a little note for myself about that, I suppose, is 80 clip exaggerating. Do something where it's like, yeah, we're doing a reconstruction of combining the slew rates of adjacent samples, seeing whether those go beyond a particular clip, doing the clip, and then uncombining them again. And even if that didn't do perfect intersample clipping solving, it might at least be a nice high frequency cut, so that could be good too. Or you'd be doing basically like slew only, and then somehow you'd be doing slew only, then you'd do 80 clip on that, and then you do sort of anti-slew only to put it back. And that could be a way of doing it. So yeah, there you go. We'll see whether this amounts to anything. Again, it might not even be a thing, but it's worth looking into, so we'll see whether anything comes from that. It can add to my stack of little note cards for things to do. So yeah, let's have a quick look at the participants and see who's still here, if any. Yeah, it still claims that I have one viewer, so that's fun. I honestly think that maybe YouTube is just lying to me now, and there's no point. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I can open the window in some other computer or something, and that'll show me how many people are showing up. But for now, the YouTube stream interface claims no matter what I do, there's one viewer, and that's depressing as anything, so we'll see. So, Ricardo, dithering is something that, oh, and Root has another question as well, so yeah, clearly I'm going to be able to talk until my time is up, so that's good, that works. I mean, gather my thoughts and figure out how to explain these things. We'll work through this together. Root, I am going to be able to explain that with pictures, so it's good that I have my paper and pen. Oh yeah, that's cool. For me, it says that there's one viewer, so that's kind of crazy. I think if I refresh the window, it'll die, so I don't trust that. I got the chat, that's enough. I will go forth without any feedback on what's going on, because maybe that's just how it's got to be. Anyways, dithering. Mojo is not a dithering plugin, but Mojo does have the floating point dithery, and that is just that is a major part of thing, but that's part of every plugin now. So I'm not sure whether to actually try to explain dithering now, or explain floating point dithering now. Tell me whether this is enough. The dithering aspect, what it says in the very bottom of the Mojo plugin, which is mostly just a tone shaper, that is on all of my plugins, and that's just a way of adding the equivalent of dithering to a fixed point thing to the fixed point sections of what the output in floating point is. Floating point has little chunks of fixed point inside it, and you can dither to those, and that's what I'm doing. So if you don't know how dithering itself works, that's another question, and I can probably get over that. But what you see in Mojo is pretty much expert mode. I would say don't worry about that too hard if you've got keep the bits of it if you're doing something of your own that correspond to what you're doing, like VST in double precision, the double processing version of it. There's this section of code there with a couple of auxiliary things like a variable that give you dithering to 64-bit floating point, and you can just use those. For the Mac, it's going to be a 32-bit. For normal VST, it's going to be a 32-bit. And that is doing a dithering like dithering exists to fixed point, but it's doing it to the fixed point chunks of the floating point format. And again, this is expert mode. As a novice, or if you don't know what some of these things are, you're not expected to understand that right off the bat. And you shouldn't have to understand it in order to just function. Like you could simply not do that. Nobody is going to be surprised by it. Now, this question about low frequencies having more energy is something that I can do more easily. Say, here are these waveforms are going to be about equal volume to the ear, especially if this is like 1K or so, and especially if this is really low, like 30, 20 hertz or whatever. If this low frequency one is really, really low, it's going to be almost inaudible compared to something that's more up in the mid-range, as long as it's not so high that you can't hear it at all. But same deal again, like little high frequency sound, that's also going to be equal volume. Like the deal with this is, if you made this high frequency sound go to the same amplitude levels as the low frequency sound, this is now unbearably louder than the bass sound. So you don't mix them that way. You mix them so that it's like the higher frequency sounds are smaller. And the interesting side effect to that is you wind up with sort of peaks and valleys, mountainy kind of looking things where the slope tends to be fairly consistent. I even did a measurement thing at one point where I was measuring how well things stuck to having a fairly consistent slope between samples, and that there was a kind of sweet spot there. But the bottom line is that for balanced audio where all the frequencies sound about similar levels rather than high frequencies completely overbearing and being way louder than any of the lower ones to the point where you can't even hear low frequencies anymore. They're going to be at about the same slope angle for comparable like triangle waves and sine waves and things. The slope angles are going to be about the same. And the high frequency ones take up less space. Now, when we talk about driving speakers and things, this is going to be like 5 volts, and this is going to be like minus 5 volts for if your total output level is like minus 5 to 5 volts or so. That's going to be a certain amplitude level. So, making the bass frequency, you're going to need to put out this many volts to make it go out this far. To make an equal volume higher frequency sound, you don't need to put nearly as many volts in. Otherwise, you'll get this. You'll get a sound that's far too loud. And that is why people will say that low frequencies have more energy. They are assuming that you're having low frequencies balancing in a mix with other frequencies so that you can hear everything. If your mix is such that like it's just grading highs and mid-ranges and stuff that are turned up so loud that you can't hear any of the bass anymore, then those can contain the same amount of energy. But if you expect stuff to balance, and especially if you expect people to be able to hear really deep bass, like if you're into dub techno or you're a Pink Floyd fan or something, and you want to hear that heartbeat, you want to hear that kick drum, you want to hear that super low frequency bass line that's like a sine that is way the heck down there. If you expect anybody to be able to hear that, you need to turn the other sounds down so that the bass frequency can push more energy and more like total voltage, and you'll end up with something that looks kind of like, you know, these mountainous forms, because the low frequency has to go farther to make an equal amplitude sound. Hopefully that if it doesn't answer your question about energy, I will dive deeper into it, but that's the essence of it. Igor, yeah, show me these developers that are just sexy. That sounds like a fun thing to look at. I'm down with that. CG is enjoying the camera shot. Yeah, I'm enjoying this lens. This is a nice little lens. I should have been buying Panasonic lenses a long time ago, because I got like third-party lenses the first 2 times, and they're very cool in their own ways. This is not perfect and has some things that are a little weird about it, but the stuff that it's good at, it's really good at. And yeah, Ricardo, that the floating point dithering, don't consider that essential. That is like my fancy pants added stuff to make stuff. So yeah, if you're trying to port that to Faust, don't worry about the dither part. Honestly, doing that at all implies that you're able to specify the variable types. If you can't specify a long double variable type, then that dither stuff is useless to you. You can't just take 32-bit variables, apply that, and have it do anything. You have to be doing you're calculating in something like an 80-bit floating point type in order to be able to get any benefit out of that. So definitely leave it out. And especially if you're not able to specify the data types that you're using. You're using something like Faust, you're looking at basic, a higher level stuff. Don't try to use the floating point dither. Stephen's commenting on how the work is a line between noise masking and true dither. Well, funny thing about Studio 10 is Studio 10 and God, what the hell was the name of the other one? Dither Me Timbers? I think it was Studio 10 and Dither Me Timbers were those two. Those aren't true dither processing at all. Those are a tone shaping that uses dither technologies. Here's how that works is what Studio 10 and Dither Me Timbers are doing is basically just analyzing if I round this up or down to the nearest quantized values, does it make the sound brighter or not? And for one of them, if you make the sound brighter, it chooses that one. Otherwise, the other one chooses the opposite. And those are not dither technologies. That's not smoothing anything out. What it's doing is trying to do a tonal quality at whatever this very high sample rate that it's doing in this very primitive way. Because in anything where you're doing a choice, like with dithering, you're doing a choice of do I round up or down to the nearest available output value. And dithering means randomizing that so that as you pass through the middle point, rather than just switching over, it statistically kind of even goes through more evenly. Like in the middle, you got a blur, and it will generally tend to center around what the value really is if you averaged it out. If you're trying to do something else, like not just another dither, does a Benford realness calculation on everything so that it will always make the choice that makes the output data more consistently like a real-world data set. And I find that increases naturalness and does tend to average stuff out in its own way. But you could also go like, can we define which of these rounding things makes the sound the most like chocolate? Like if you can analyze, if you can define what that would mean, or define like which thing would make the sound more far away, that'd be really cool if I could come up with that one. If you worked out a way of defining that and then reconstructing it where you're able to figure it out, go like, okay, that's smoothest. Like it's another good note to make, I guess, is if you were able to run the numbers on rounding the thing up or rounding the thing down and went, which of these options, when averaged back out again, when played back on something that's going to smooth off high frequencies, which of those gives me the smoothest end result? And then you picked that one, you'd be doing a dither type thing that gave you, rather than just random noise, it would always try to mute and attenuate the highs and probably make things sound farther away. So I'll sketch that out as well. Which is softer when reconstructed, is what I'm writing. Because that is actually very doable. It should be able to take output values. It can save a list of the quantized output values and basically reconstruct those, soften it to some extent, and go like, okay, here's the trajectory that we're on. What departs from this trajectory the least? And then it'll always pick that from the available options. So yeah, I gotta scroll a little bit up because Rip was talking about something. Yeah, cutting on the sides from 120 hertz up, you don't necessarily have to go that extreme about it. That is just from vinyl times, but it does still also have merit in modern times to an extent. And I'll tell you why. Kick the pitches down to sub lows. Yep. Most difficult mix. High frequencies are indeed dampened over longer distances by air. Do I have a blank page? Kinda. We will call this my visual representation. Say these are speakers, and one of them is putting out a wave, and another one is putting out a wave. This can be representing the wave a little bit. Now, if they're both in phase, which is what happens when the side channel doesn't have a lot of bass information, they're both compressing the air with each other. In fact, if you're in this little tiny room, we're in a little tiny room, so both of these speakers are pressurizing the room. They can only push as much as they can. But if they are out of phase, meaning that the sides have as much energy as mid, they're going in opposite directions, and they end up not changing the pressure of the room at all. And the loudness of bass is how much pressure is in the room. So the deal is, if you are in stereo and you're working with woofers, sub frequencies, you can have out of phase stuff. You don't have to filter out things in the sides where, you know, because that's what that's doing. Is if you're filtering lows out of the side channel, you're removing the ability for the woofers to be moving in opposite directions, like one going in, one going out. The closer together the speakers are, the more it will make that situation of they're going in opposite directions produce no sound. In fact, you can clump them together, and if they were in phase, you basically have a slot-loaded hyper woofer there. Where I've actually built speakers like this, where the vibrations of the speakers cancel each other out because you've got them sort of bolted together, but they are both compressing air, so the air comes out the sides like the slot loading and produces big low frequencies. But if they were out of phase, they would be going in opposite directions and compressing no air anywhere. They'd just be burning a lot of energy doing nothing. Now take them away from that slot loaded configuration where they're right next to each other and put them in the room. If they're moving together, they're pressurizing the air together just as if they were locked. But if they are moving in opposite directions, the air is still coming from one and going to the other and wasting energy. So it comes from vinyl days, but it is also, and in vinyl days, what was wrong with that situation was the needle would have to go up and down because side to side is mono for vinyl. And if the needle has to go up and down too much, it can pop out of the groove or do bad things that way. But with regards to speakers, PA systems, subwoofers, laptops, often laptops have a single central speaker which is producing sort of mid-range on down, if that. And anything like that, if you have out-of-phase bass, and it's being either in a room where you have to compress the room properly, or being some to mono for a single speaker or subwoofer, the out-of-phase bass is just going to be canceled out completely. If it's in a single speaker like on the laptop or a single subwoofer, then you'll never hear it. There's no point in even having it. If there are two woofers, they wind up not making audible sound because the air is going from one to the other, but burning lots of energy. And in fact, when you're doing that, the way the air is transferring from the one to the other is causing it to be easier for the amp to push, like the impedance of the energy being put out is dropping. So you can have a situation where you can blow up your woofers that way, or hurt them through having them excurse too far or whatever, because rather than both doing the same job, they're like feeding each other. The energy is being burned uselessly. It's not producing acoustic volume. Instead, it's just moving these woofer elements. It's moving these woofers really hard. And yeah, not useful. So that's why people advocate doing the filtering of side content. And honestly, in a lot of situations, you shouldn't have to worry about that. Like having bass, say, only in one speaker and not in the other, that's going to produce side content, and it's also going to produce mid content in such a way where if you were playing that in a room, you're not getting to use both of the woofers for your bass anymore, but it's still not going to do anything particularly nasty as far as like burning up woofers or having them expend energy needlessly. Instead, it's just not the most efficient way of generating lows. And if you had that situation and then you filtered the lows out of the side, what you're basically doing is just putting some of the lows in the other speaker and monoing it to some point. So Bo is now asking tips on learning more about the math behind digital filters. I don't know what to tell you. It's taken me a long time to learn them too. And some of that math I don't follow. Some of the stuff like biquads, I don't fully understand how that works out. I'm using the DSP cookbook type stuff, slightly modified, because I was able to modify it to some extent. But it took many tries to be able to do that and not break it. So as far as learning about the math, you'd have to go to school and learn the math, I think. That's more than I've been able to do. That's why I do different sounding things that don't always use the same math that everybody uses. But that's my best advice. Like, go to school for math. It's more than I did. Maybe you'll learn stuff that I don't know about. EB is asking, new camera? No, not a new camera, but it's a new lens. And that has us, my concurrent viewers is still 1. I have no idea how many people are out there. I guess that's just a thing. That's just a thing that I have to deal with now. Oh, and the color correction, it's the lens, and this is a lookup table that I made. I'll tell you how I made it. Cookbook, not clipbook. And it's a general category of things. It's like when you look up, this is how you do a biquad filter for a high pass, and they have some kind of way of doing it, and you're supposed to just do that, and you think that that solves all your problems. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So the color correction is, and I'm glad you like it, is 50% of a lookup table that I made by taking a picture with watercolor paints on them and holding it up to the camera, getting a shot of that from the video, taking it into, I think it was Affinity Photo, and editing it in Affinity Photo until the colors of the watercolors on the piece of paper that I took a picture of looked the same as the actual piece of paper next to it on the screen. So that involved cutting back a lot of the reds and things, like toning back some of the ways in which the raw pigments just jumped off of the screen and were way too hyped out. It's the opposite of like your teal and orange color grading. It's the opposite of fancy color grading, and it's more akin to like film style color grading where things are just chilled out a little bit. And it is, I put it on 50% because I'll show you what it happens when I put it on 100%. There's no reason I shouldn't. Like, you can see that this is already fairly chill looking. Oh, hang on. I want to set it to filters here. I can apply a lookup table. So if I take it off, it looks like this. And the reds and things are more intense. It does look good. This is what the camera wants to do. If I put it to 50, it looks like this. And if I held up watercolor colors that were very intense, they would register as about right. And if I put it to 100, it looks like this. This is the full correction. And that's kind of more noir-y, but it's also a little brighter. So I decided to put it to 50% just so that it was a little bit redder and warmer and without quite as much brightness. And oh, actually, the 50% question had nothing to do with lookup tables and was about Spiral too. So let's see. We got maybe 10-15 minutes or so going. So, right, LCR mixing. Yes, a lot of people really like LCR mixing. The Spiral 2 presence knob. Why is it on 50% by default? I think because that sounded good to me. I don't remember exactly what the code is on that one. Spiral 2 presence is a nifty little trick having to do with referring to previous samples. So I know that's part of what was going on there. But why was it on 50%? Because that sounded best to me. And I don't really have a better answer. Some of these things, when I'm doing something that's a little unusual like that, there is no correct answer. Fairly often it's a thing where it is messing with the tone in a way that is useful to me, or helping the effect to get, the effect that it's supposed to get better. And as such, it's already departing from what complete pristine purity would be. So if I wanted to find the sound of a plugin by going, it does this and it does that, and here's another thing that it does, I'll apply a certain amount of that and I'll come up with a setting where I feel like this is the default. This is a good amount. That's what I went through with tape. I did tape in the attempt to make a perfect control-less, like run stuff to tape plugin, but there was too much bass first time around. So what I ended up doing was putting a simple control and going like, okay, since people feel this is too much bass, and I was basically happy with, no pun intended, we're going to call exactly half of that the right amount. And exactly half of that is also, 60 dB down, which is like a bit shift. And on that ground, that's a really clean way of modifying the waveform that I have that was going to be added directly to it. I get to do a amplitude correction that is the cleanest possible amplitude correction by making it 0.5. So that's the change that I put into the tape plugin when I called it Tape Redux, was just going, okay, fine. 1 is now what I had previously because people thought that was too much. 0 is nothing in case you want to not have any of this bass boosting going on. And then the default is going to be exactly 50%. So often I'll try to calibrate stuff so that the plugins settle on 50% settings for the defaults. Especially for the stuff that can be like it goes away or it becomes too much. I'm going to want the default, I'm going to want the correct setting to be sitting in the middle, and then you just line stuff up and go from there. That's more a user interface style of thing. Even though they are not plugins with a designed GUI in there, then it's still going to have like you can have the default setting be 90% of the way over to the right, but I'm probably going to want the default setting to be halfway, just so that stuff can sort of sit there. Is there a diminishing order of amplitude for a perfect tone in the harmonic spectrum? Depends upon what you mean by perfect, but I honestly feel that there is a sweet spot for mixing, especially if you want stuff like bass to be obvious, and the amplitude will diminish on a consistent basis, where like amplitudes will be different levels, and if you sum all kinds of stuff together, you'll wind up with these fairly consistent slopes, because low frequencies will take up more space, high frequencies, it's kind of like as if you were doing octaves in a Perlin noise generation in game design, and you wind up with mountains and things where everything is kind of navigable and you can go anywhere, but there aren't any incredibly steep cliffs or anything like that. Everything is, navigable. And audio works kind of like that as well. Like if your ear can navigate all the pressure changes and they're all about the same slope, that reads as harmonious to the ear. It sounds good, it sounds balanced, like there's depth and fullness and bass to things. And everything kind of balances. So you can call that perfect tone, or you can be like, I want more high frequencies, I want more glitter and boom and tinkle in my sound. Therefore, perfect for me is a little more exaggerated. But there is in general a diminishing order of amplitude. In general, bass is going to require more energy and swing farther in the waveform in order to be heard properly. So Mateus, and I will not forget you. I'll at least show that. Grab a screenshot of it. The SRS WOW works as a process in a mix. That's what people have been asking for me. Chad from Beauty Pill really wanted me to do this, and I never quite succeeded, which is not to say that I can't go back in future. You can use stuff like that as a process in a mix. My Seriously plugin does not really do that. So I'm going to be looking to enhance that in future. It needs to crank the side amplitude a lot more than it does. It's doing some of the things, but it's not really accurately doing it. And what the SRS thing would do as a process in a mix, and you can do it with outboard gear, like I have a little crate box from the company Crate, and it's called Studio Module, and it is the SRS thing in a little tiny box. Jonas asked, did any of the bigger plugin companies approach me looking for consultation? No, but Native Instruments tried to buy the clip-only algorithm at one point. At the time, they wanted to give me a flat fee, which was not very large, in order for the permanent and total rights to use that. And I wasn't even doing open source at the time, so they had no access to it at all. And at the time, I said, no, but can we talk about royalties? And they went, and they just noped out of there. So that's the only time, really. At this stage, they could have it simply for crediting me, since it is MIT licensed. So if they want it, if they still want it, all they got to do is credit me publicly for use of that, and then they can incorporate it in their own work. Which is not to say that they will. They'd probably be happier to pay a fixed rate and never credit anything. But I'm not really sure how useful that would be, because presumably they wanted to use it as one of like the little things that you can plug into Massive or whatever. It's like, oh, this is the clip for this bit and so on, and they wanted that. Yeah, Native Instruments wanted to buy it, but it did not actually lead to anything. So, final thing. Oh, how do I come up with plugin names? I just think of them best that I can do. So, final thing. It is 12:47. I was supposed to go for an hour and 47. I ran a little bit. I didn't get started early enough, so I'll take a little moment to talk about this, and then we'll be done. So the idea here is that this is a chord chart, and it's fairly similar to all the previous chord charts that I've done. And the idea there, let me hold that somewhere where it can be read and seen. I decided that the best way of doing this now is to have the circle of fifths going around this way, and then within each key, because these are keys, each of these chords with the minor, or like G7th here, if you're in the Mixolydian scale, you're playing 7th, and that fits within this scale. It's a characteristic note for the scale. Each of these chords fits within this key. Like all the notes in the A minor or the C major or the F major sit in the same key. Or G7th, you play the 7th, and that also sits in the key. It doesn't depart from the key at all. So the idea is you can play stuff vertically along there, or you can move around by the circle of fifths here. Each step with the circle of fifths changes only one note in the key that you're in. And typically with a lot of those, like if you go from C to G, you C major to G major. You can do that by going to a different key, but it's also present, see, in the G7th that's in the key. So some of these things, or the F, that's actually an F add 11. I might have it wrong though. The Lydian mode F. The root third and fifth of these are present both in the immediately adjacent ones and in different places in the actual key itself. So what you'll find with this arrangement, and I came up with this arrangement, I think this is the one, like this is the one that's going to work for me, is that if you're playing music, you're going to find that going like, okay, so C, G, A minor, F, that's 4-chord song. There are little patterns within this chord chart that I'm holding up like in this way specifically so that if you need to take a screenshot of it before I scan it or do anything with it, then you can do that. I've written the modes on here. I've written some of the, like the 13th and the 7th flat 9 for Phrygian and stuff. That includes the characteristic notes of the chords for things like the Phrygian mode, because it's in E minor. E minor Phrygian means you start with E minor and then you can go to F. But it also means that in the E minor you got a flat 9th in there. And anywhere you go, the same pattern is going to produce the same sort of thing. Like you can do a minor 4-chord song by going like, you know, E minor, B minor, D flat minor, A minor, and that is 4-chord song but in a minor key. Or you can go like E flat 7, B flat 7, C minor, A flat 7, same deal but with 7th chords. Yeah, you can take the screenshot. I've been holding it in basically the right place. Let me see. I'm not sure exactly what you wanted from me. That's probably pretty good. You can see I've got the modes written on there. I will scan it. This is like one of those things where I'm doing the best that I can with it. Red circles mean you can fairly easily play this chord on guitar. That's why I've got those there. And there's a lot of accessible chords in here. And I find that there are things like, you know, E minor, F sharp minor, G, F sharp minor, G, F sharp minor, E, that's roundabout. Do, 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 do. A lot of amazing songs fall into neat little areas on this chart. Turns out that doing the simple like diatonic scale and assembling them this way and then shifting everything around so that all the keys have the equivalent scale in there was what it needed to have. And so I've got the system set up now, and I have not updated the chord organ thing, but as near as I can tell, like practically nobody is working with chord organs now anyway, so it's like there's nothing really lost there. I've got the chord organs now set up with, they are also programmed so that small voltage changes make small changes along this line or along this line, two different voltages coming in. And with a bit of luck, that will make more interesting generative music. Honestly, I feel like this, like I'm getting screwed a bit in how this works, because for like half a year now, at least, I have been working with this generative music where I've got the computer thinking up what chords to play on a semi-random basis. It's playing patterns and then it's sometimes evolving them, and it's picking new chords in such a way that it makes chord sequences that are basically sitting within a key, although I could also make it jump farther than that, but it's basically taking chord sequences that are fairly within a key and are followable. And I think anybody who's listening to this stuff must just be under the conclusion that I'm writing it, and I'm not. I'm jamming along to it, and the synthesizer will throw in variations that go to a completely different key or go to a completely different chord sequence. And the fun of that for me is in following those chord sequences and having it think up some interesting stuff to challenge me with. If I make it too challenging, I start playing really dissonant, ugly stuff. But if it's really fitting in so it can wander fairly far afield, but it's staying within a tight cluster, or at least being pretty predictable most of the time, then I can jam along to stuff and it'll keep throwing in variations and it'll sound like I wrote it. Or maybe I wrote it and I didn't write it all that perfectly, or I made some funny choices, but I'm not writing any of it. It's not even a computer. It's Turing machines, which are randomness generators, and the randomness generators are generating this stuff. So it's programmatic or procedural music where I could just turn it on and walk away. And it would be doing these little jams, and then all of a sudden you start getting variations on the chords that are being played. Oh, it's going to a G now, and it's shifted into the key of D flat somehow, and so on. And it's doing all of that already. I've been doing this for half a year. I'm trying to keep doing it better and better. And yeah, it's kind of like terrain generators and 3D graphics. So I feel like this is a bit of a frustration for me, but I'll just see where it goes. At some point, somebody's going to ask, like, oh, hey, where's your score? What computer is feeding it these chord changes? At which point it's like, oh yeah, there is no computer feeding it the chord changes. The synthesizer is thinking of the music itself. I'm just there to jam along with it. That synthesizer is thinking of the music. And that is hopefully the mind-blowing part. But I think what's killing me there is it's not thinking of dumb enough changes that people get that it's a machine doing it. It's thinking of such good changes that people assume it's me doing it. Go figure. So let me look at a couple of really quick questions, and then I need to log off. So I need to go and chill. I got a couple of good ideas. There was the idea on doing a more exaggerated version of 80 clip, and there was the idea on doing a new approach to dithering that exaggerates smoothing, and that might have usefulness too. What does the B means flats. That's always means flats. And 13 is a kind of chord. Like, as you keep adding thirds, you go 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th. So I might not really be right about the 13, but basically that's my way of saying 13 exists in the chord that belongs to the Dorian mode. And so the note that says Dorian mode in this key is a 13th. And hence I put that there. You don't have to, like, you can leave the numbers off. For this stuff, if you just play the major or minor and don't play any of the 7th or 11th or 13ths, you're still going to get useful results. Stick to whether it says major or minor accurately, and you'll get good results out of it. It's just that you can also use 7ths or sometimes 9ths. Add 11th, I think, also counts as sharp 11. It's not the flat 11th you want, it's the sharp 11th. And, diminished Locrian does not have a 5th. So that's extra. The extra weirdest one is like between the major and the minor, strangely. But, yeah, and honestly, if you start getting into those 11th and 13th and stuff, you're going a little bit over my head too, because I'm just trying to learn new things about music theory here. So, yeah, final questions and quick answers. I don't know how to read your name, but I'll ask the question anyway. Did tube tape emulations achieve that true sound? I don't think so, no. I don't think anybody in digital has really managed that. I've gotten as close as I can. In general, I don't feel that they have. I think that there's still something lacking. And I have some theories around that, and I've worked on that in various ways. You can get pretty close. You can do fairly well. But no, I don't think digital is really there. And advantages of minimum phase IIR versus minimum phase. I'm not aware that there is such a thing as minimum phase IIR. That has just confused me, because you can do minimum phase FIR by having the sort of impulse that you're making the EQ with be symmetrical, centered on the sample coming in, but that causes pre-ring, and minimum phase inevitably has pre-ring, and I don't think that's musically useful. So I often prefer IIR filters to minimum phase filters, specifically because, it would be 13 chord would be a suspended diminished fifth or suspended fourth, something like that, plus an octave. And yes, that is exactly what that is. So yeah, I prefer to not use minimum phase filters because they are symmetrical, so they have pre-ring, and pre-ring doesn't exist in nature. It's good for accuracy and calculation of scientific data, but I don't find it very musical. And totally random generation or Perlin Gaussian or something else. Well, these are just shift registers. Basically, all Turing machines are shift registers. They keep cycling and generate a random thing kind of by the arrangement of bits, but they only change one bit at a time. So they'll make this cyclic thing, but in making the cyclic thing, they can only change one bit at a time, so it gradually evolves into something new. You could just also have a purely random generation, at which point you'd have a chord sequence within, you could have a random chord sequence within a tight little area where you'd always be able to predict what the key is, most likely, but you wouldn't be able to predict what the next chord is. But that's less desirable, because when you start getting too random and you don't have regularity and repeating patterns, you no longer can guess what's going to happen next. And that's less interesting to a listener because you want to be able to identify patterns. So with that, let's pop you guys back in. Actually, I can't yet because I have the window open. With that, let us fade you out and pop you back into the web page that you came from. And we'll call that a day. I need to go lay down a bit. This is hard work, but I think that has been good. And on that note, I'll talk to you folks later. Bye-bye. And I'm going to play some music on Tuesday and Thursday. And as usual, I'm hanging around with friends playing Minecraft on Wednesday. You can join me then. I don't have to answer technical questions on Wednesdays, but I am hanging around for like maybe as many as 5 hours or so. So there's time in case I did. But I won't be publicizing that, so just watch this channel for it or whatever, because I'm not going to make announcements about it. And on that note, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.